afternoon, everyone. My name is Brigid Hughes. I'm the editor of the Brooklyn magazine, A Public Space, and I'm delighted that you could all join us today for The Nature of Sacrifice. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that books by these three wonderful authors will be for sale after the event at Greenlight Bookstore's stall outside, or right outside this room, and they'll all be available to sign their books. So the format for today, we're going to start with 3 short readings from our 3 authors, and then a Q&A, and we'd love to sort of welcome you all to join in. So if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to raise your hand. And with that, I'll just introduce everyone very quickly. To my immediate left is A.M. Holmes, the author of the memoir The Mistress's Daughter, as well as a number of novels, including May We Be Forgiven, The End of Alice, and Jack, as well as the story collections, The Safety of Objects, and Things You Should Know. She's written a travel book, Los Angeles, People, Places, and the Castle on the Hill, and her books have been translated into 22 languages. She's also received a number of awards and is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. To her left, joining us from Chicago, is Joe Meno, a fiction writer and playwright. He's the winner of the Nelson Algren Literary Award, a Pushcart Prize, the Great Lakes Book Award, and was a finalist for the Story Prize. He's the editor of Chicago Noir, the Classics, and the author of 2 story collections, as well as multiple novels, including the bestsellers Hairstyles of the Damned, The Boy Detective Fails, and Office Girl. His latest novel, which we'll read from today, is Marvel and a Wonder. He's a professor in the Department of Creative Writing at Columbia College in Chicago. And to his left is Terry McMillan, who discovered her love of literature while she was shelving books at the local library. In 1987, she published her debut novel, Mama, which won the Doubleday New Fiction Contest. During her tenure as a professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson, she wrote her 3rd novel, Waiting to Exhale, which became a major motion picture, won 7 Grammy Awards and an MTV Movie Award. She recently wrote Who Asked You, and her next novel, I Almost Forgot About You, will be published next year. And with that, I will turn things over to A.M.
Hi there. Okay. I'm just going to sing a quick song. I'm just kidding. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of May We Be Forgiven, because that's what I was told to do. I never follow directions, so I thought I'd make an exception. May we be forgiven. An incantation, a prayer, the hope that I'd somehow come out of this alive. Was there ever a time you thought, I'm doing this on purpose, I'm screwing up, and I don't know why? Do you want my recipe for disaster? The warning sign. Last year, Thanksgiving at their house, 20 or 30 people at tables spreading from the dining room into the living room, stopping abruptly at the piano bench. He was at the head, picking turkey out of his teeth, talking about himself. I kept watching him as I went back and forth, carrying plates into the kitchen, the edges of my fingers dipping into unnameable goo, cranberry sauce, sweet potato, cold pearl onion, gristle. With every trip from the dining room to the kitchen, I hated him more. Every sin of our childhood, beginning with his birth, came back. They named him George. Geo, he'd like to be called, like it was something cool, scientific, analytical, mathematical. Geode, I called him, like a sedimentary rock. I stood in their kitchen picking at the carcass while George's wife Jane did the dishes, bright blue gloves on, up to her elbows in suds. My fingers were deep in the bird, the hollow body still warm, the best bits of stuffing packed in. I dug with my fingers and brought stuffing to my lips. Jane looked at me, my mouth moist, my fingers curled into what would have been the turkey's G-spot if they had such things. She lifted her hands out of the water and came towards me to plant one on me, not friendly. The kiss was serious, wet, full of desire. She did it, then snapped off her gloves and walked out of the room. I was holding the counter, gripping it with greasy fingers. Dessert was served, and Jane asked if anyone wanted coffee and went back into the kitchen, and I followed her like a dog, wanting more. Are you ignoring me? I asked. She said nothing and handed me the coffee. Could you just let me have a little pleasure, she said, a little something that's just for myself? She paused. Cream and sugar? She asked. From Thanksgiving to Christmas and on into New Year, all I thought of was George screwing Jane. George on top of her, once fantastically, George having her from the back, his eyes fixed on the wall-mounted television, the ticker tape of news headlines trickling across the bottom of the screen. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was convinced that despite his charms, his excess of professional achievement, George wasn't very good in bed, and that all he knew about sex he learned from the pages of magazines read furtively while shitting. It was almost 9. I'm not going to digress. Just don't do it. I can't believe, who writes this stuff? Anyway, it's almost 9 on a February evening when Jane calls. I need your help, she says. Don't worry, I say, before I even know what the worry is. I imagine her calling me from their kitchen, the long curly cord wrapping around her body. George is at the police station, she says. Did he do something wrong? Apparently. 33 minutes later, I'm inside the police station. We wanted to take him to the hospital, but he wouldn't go, the cop says. Just kept repeating, he's a dangerous man and we should lock him up. Personally, I think the man needs a doctor. You don't walk away from something like that unscathed. So he got into a fight? Car accident, bad one. Was it his fault? I ask. The next time I see George, he's in a cubicle in the back of the emergency room, his arms and legs tied to a gurney. Do you know why you're here? The doctor asks him. I've got bad aim, George says. Later, my wife Claire, who's leaving for a business trip, tells me not to leave Jane alone. She's very vulnerable. Imagine if you went nuts. Wouldn't you want someone to stay with me and keep an eye on the house? It's funny how something quickly becomes a routine, a way of doing business. I stay with Jane and it's as though we're playing house. At night, I take out the trash, lock the door. She makes a snack, we watch television and read. I read whatever it was that George was reading, his newspapers, magazines, the big history of Thomas Jefferson that sits beside the bed. The accident happens, and then it happens. It doesn't happen the night of the accident. It happens the night after that, the night after Claire told me not to leave Jane alone, the night after Claire left for China. We go back to the house, and Jane heats 100-calorie brownies in the microwave. I scoop non-fat ice cream onto them, and she sprays them with 0-calorie whipped cream. I cheer them further with chocolate sprinkles, and we snack in silence. I take out the trash and change out of my clothes, same clothes I've been wearing for 2 days, and I put on a pair of his pajamas. I hug Jane. I want to be comforting. I don't think anything will happen. I apologize, I say, without knowing what I'm saying, and then she's against me. She puts her hands on the sides of her skirt and slides it down. Jane pulls me towards her. Somehow the hospital lets George out, or more likely, he simply decides to leave. Inexplicably, he's able to walk out unnoticed in the middle of the night. He can't find his key, so he rings the bell and the dog barks. I think I remember that part, the dog barking. Or maybe he didn't ring the bell and the dog didn't bark. Maybe he took the spare key from under the mat and like an intruder came silently into his own house. I don't know how long he stood there. I don't know how long he waited before he lifted the lamp from her side of the bed and smashed it on her head. That's when I woke up. Jane is screaming. The one blow wasn't enough. George looks at me and then picks up the lamp again and swings it at her. The porcelain vase that is the base explodes against her head. George tosses aside what remains of the lamp, blood streaming down his fingers, picks up the phone and throws it to me. I stand facing him, wearing his pajamas. We are the same, like mimes. We have the same gestures, the same faces, the family chin, the same mismatched selves. I'm staring at him, not knowing how this is going to work out. Call it in, he says. That was cheerful.
Whoa.
Joe Meno.
Thank you. I'm going to read from the first chapter of this new novel. It's set in 1995 in a small town in Indiana, and it follows this grandfather and his 16-year-old grandson, who's named Quentin, who's biracial, and these two men are struggling with much difficulty to find who they are and where they meet. So I'm going to read from the beginning here. Over the low-lying fields, over the wide meadows, the sun, rampant, galloping westward, beating back the night. On that Sunday in July 1995, the grandfather woke early thinking of the boy. He walked down the short hallway to find the boy Quentin was once again not in bed. He took in the odd odor of the boy's quarters, dirty gym socks, exotic pets, and rubber cement, but could not make out the smell of sleep. He went downstairs and put on his white cattleman hat and boots, then walked outside half a dozen paces to the hen house where he found the boy Quentin asleep beside a pile of comic books. The boy's Walkman was still playing, his eyeglasses folded near his face. At the boy's feet was a backpack crammed with clothes and junk food, a map, and other odds and ends. Jim leaned over and switched the tape player off, then nudged his grandson awake with the toe of his boot. It was 5:30. The sun had been up for 12 minutes already, but none of the birds had made a sound. The boy startled awake, wiped a silver streak of drool from his chin, then put on his glasses. Though he was almost 16, he was only a fraction of that in sensibility. Closer to a child in both manner and maturity, he was also a halfie, or what the grandfather had sometimes been known to call a mixed breed, though that wasn't the right word either. The boy's face, round, olive-complected, appeared even darker in the shadows of the henhouse. Lying there, he looked like a burn, like a strange nursling. They found the boy's mother, Deirdre, Jim's daughter and only offspring, asleep at the wheel of her rusty foreign model hatchback. She was passed out, with an empty vial of someone else's painkiller medication spilling out of her purse. Inside, the windshield was covered with a brilliant dew. When the grandfather shook her awake, she looked up and smiled like a child, though she was 37. Her eyes opaque and unnaturally lovely, these the symptoms of her ongoing dependence on pain pills and methamphetamines. Before he could get her into the house, she vomited on their clothes. Jim nodded at his grandson for help. They carried up the back porch, through the kitchen, and then upstairs to the bathroom where they got her out of her soiled things. Her jeans were covered with beige-gray puke. The grandfather grabbed her under her arms while the boy pulled off her pants, her thighs as soft-looking and as fleshy as they'd been when she was a baby. She was not wearing any underwear. Her pubis had been shaved, and above that blank space was a model tattoo of the Tasmanian devil, the one from the Bugs Bunny cartoons, operating an old-fashioned push lawnmower. The sight of such a thing made Jim's privates wither. Also, his daughter's flesh seemed to be covered in an extravagant amount of glitter. Why? Jim did not know. The boy tried to look away. They did not say a word to each other nor exchange a single glance, Jim and the boy, sick with compassion for a thing they could not fix nor understand. "Get yourself cleaned up and come down to breakfast," the grandfather said to her before quickly making his way from the room, the boy following at his heels. That morning, the grandfather and grandson started their work by candling the chicken eggs one by one, holding each above the milky floodlight. At the beginning of the chore, there was no conversation, both of them coming awake in their still asleep bodies, and then the grandfather asked, "Go on and tell me, what kind of girls do you like?" The question seemed to unfairly puzzle the boy. Quentin shrugged, looked away, and then sniffed his fingernails. He was in the middle of reenacting a moment from a video game, torturing a hen with the handle of a rake. "I don't know," the boy said. "Any kind, I guess." "You like skinny girls?" "No." You like fat girls?" "No, no way." "Redheads?" "No." "Brunettes?" "No, sir." "Blonde girls?" "No." "Do you like black girls?" "No." "White girls?" "I guess." "You like white girls?" "I don't know, I guess so." "Well, I think you'd have better luck with black girls," the grandfather said, tossing another yoker into the tin bucket. The boy seriously considered his grandfather's words for a long time in silence, feeling he'd somehow been insulted, but not knowing the exact reason why. Later, the boy discovered a frail-looking peep with an inflamed, distended stomach. He knelt down beside the creature and closely inspected it. "Sir?" The grandfather asked. "This one looks like it's got mushy chick." Jim leaned down, poking the animal with his forefinger, and nodded. "You're right, go on, put him in the other brooder. We don't need them other ones to get it, too." The boy was wearing a T-shirt with some black man's face emblazoned on the front. "Ice Cube," it read beneath the man's portrait. On the back of this T-shirt, it read, "America KKK's Most Wanted," or something equally stupid. The shirt was something the boy had picked up at the beginning of summer when he and his mother had spent a week with her new boyfriend up in Detroit. Whenever the boy happened to wear the shirt, Jim believed it made him look like a turd, an actual walking human turd. Upon first seeing it, he decided he'd pay the T-shirt no mind. The boy was now talking to this sick peep, nuzzling it against his chin. "All right, go on and leave that one alone. We got other chores to get to yet. You can come back and visit with him when we're all done. If he dies, I am never going to church again. What? Grandfather asked. If he dies, then that's it for me and Jesus. Well, I guess you can worry about that later, the grandfather said. The boy nodded and went back to counting the other peeps. He placed his headphones back over his ears, and soon the rapid thump of an angry voice howling over some sort of drum rattled from his vicinity. Kneeling there in the sawdusted coop, Jim took a hard look at the boy's face, searching for some resemblance to himself, something in the character of the boy's nose or ears or lips, an activity that always left him with an unquestionable feeling of aggravation. The boy turned to ask his grandfather a question then, pushing his headphones off. Sir? Did you believe it's possible for a human being to talk to an animal? Jim smiled. Well, we talk to the chickens all day. No, not tame ones, like wild ones, like in the movies, like in cartoons, so they can understand you. I don't know if I can say I ever thought about it. The boy nodded and then looked away. I can do it. You can. I'm pretty sure I can. I can talk to animals and some trees. It's because I've developed a new way of using my ears. I can hear things most other mortals cannot. The grandfather frowned, and in that moment felt neither disappointment nor pity, only a slight grief. Quentin, sir, do you ever have a thought you keep to yourself? Quentin shrugged. I don't know. I don't think so. Why? You might want to think about trying that sometime. Keeping those sorts of things to yourself. The boy nodded and went silent. Another few seconds passed, and then the blare of the boy's headphones once again began to desecrate the air. By evening, the chores had been done and their dinner eaten. In the dark, the boy wandered around outside, searching for insects to feed his reptiles. He found a pill bug and dropped it into a glass. He looked up and heard the sound of a cricket and followed it in the hen house. And there, inside the brooder, the boy discovered the peep with mushy chick had died. It lay on its side in a pile of sawdust. The boy called out for his grandfather, who came looking worried. What is it? He asked, but the boy only pointed. The grandfather frowned and then cradled the creature in his palm, and after a moment made to toss it in the trash, but the boy insisted they buried it. In the dark, they held an informal service, burying the animal near the roots of a birch tree the boy seemed to favor. The boy said a prayer and then covered the animal with 2 shovelfuls of dirt. It was despicable, the grandfather thought, looking away from the face of his grandson. It occurred to him that this is what was wrong with the country, the world. It's what happened when you stop seeing things get born and live and then die. It's what would happen when a person, a town, a whole country didn't have a rudimentary understanding of how things ought to be. Later that night, the grandfather awoke with a terrible urge to urinate. He did his business, patiently making water, and then passed the boy's room again. The boy was once again not in his bed. The grandfather sighed, tromped down the stairs, and pulled on his muck-covered boots. Quentin was in the chicken coop, asleep on a plank of hay, his headphones blaring, glasses folded up. Jim nudged the boy awake, taking a seat beside him. Are you running away again? The boy nodded. Well, how come you don't get any farther? The boy shrugged. What are you running away from? The boy sniffled. Is it me? The boy shook his head. Is it your mother? The boy hesitated, then shook his head again. Is it the peep, the one that died? The boy shook his head. Well, then what is it? After a long pause, the boy finally muttered, everything. Jim let out a disgruntled snort and forced himself to clear his throat. He looked around the coop for some witness, for anyone to see the boy's cupidity, his off-putting weirdness, but found there was only the chickens asleep in their roosts. He felt for the boy a familiar sadness then, but did not know what to say or to do. Thank you.
And Terry McMillan.
Well, I'm going to read wait, where is it? Just a minute, I just had it. Kind of like a monologue, I guess. Okay. And I'll just let my character, Betty Jean. So, I'm just going to read this little section, okay? I'll be the first to admit that I probably could have been a better mother. And I've got 3 grown children to prove it. It goes without saying that I do love them. I'm just disappointed in how they turned out. Trinetta is the baby. And at 27, she seems to have a hard time saying no to drugs and low-life men, which has made her allergic to working more than a few months at a time. Sometimes it's hard to believe she's the same daughter who lived on the honor roll all during high school. But then between 9th grade and junior college, she fell in love too many times to count and lost her mind. She also loved beautiful teeth and was on her way to becoming a dental technician when she got pregnant. Over the years, Trinetta tiptoed back and forth, and the last I heard, she's only 12 units shy of being employable. I used to remind her of this small fact, but she could just get defensive. She has given birth to 3 children. The last one was Noxzema. Her daddy went to court and got custody after she drank some shampoo and had to be rushed to emergency. I wish he would have claimed those other 2. Who they belong to is a mystery that may never get solved. In all honesty, I'm one step away from calling Child Protective Services on her if she don't clean up her act soon. My oldest, Quentin, likes cracking necks and backs, getting married and getting divorced. He's a chiropractor and lives up in Oregon where hardly any black people live, which has made it very easy for him to forget he is black. He enjoys being a token and hates the ghetto. He even calls me mother, which gets on my nerves because it sounds so official, and he says it using the same tone as telemarketers when they ask for Mrs. Butler. I've told him about 1,000 times I don't like being called mother, but he just ignores me. He was the same way when he was little. He doesn't bend, does everything his way, which is what has made him so difficult to like. Somehow, some way, he has made himself believe he's superior to most folks, and I don't know how he got this way and why he feels more like a stranger I just happened to give birth to. The only time I seem to hear from him is when he gets married or divorced. He's on his 4th or 5th wife. I can't keep up. One thing they all have in common is that they're white, not that I care. But why they all have to be blonde is what baffles me. On top of everything, Quentin has the nerve to act like he's religious. He does not go to any church that I know of, but claims to read the Bible every single morning. He must be a slow reader. Then there's Dexter. He's in the middle, another smart one who fell in love with stupidity. He's doing 9 to 12 years for carjacking a Filipino woman in a Costco parking lot in broad daylight using a deadly weapon, which to this day he claims was just a flashlight and not a gun. He and his high school buddy, thought this would be a fun thing to do since the bus was taking too long and they were both high on that marijuana and Bud Lights. Dexter said they were just trying to get out to Valencia so Buddy could go see his girlfriend in the hospital who had just had a baby, and Buddy didn't want to miss visiting hours. Dexter swore up and down this was all Buddy's idea, even though Dexter was also supposed to meet his girlfriend, Skittles, at Great America, that amusement park right down the street from the hospital. Unfortunately, that marijuana caused a temporary memory loss because Dexter forgot that even stolen cars run on gas, which is why the highway patrolman didn't believe him when Dexter told him the bright yellow Jetta with the Davina on the custom plates was his. If I had it to do over, I probably wouldn't have had any kids. It's too much responsibility trying to steer somebody else's life when you're still trying to navigate your own. Back then, kids didn't come with instructions, so you had to wing it. And based on all those books full of recipes on how to be a deluxe parent and raise damn near flawless children, I guess I'd have to give myself a C or a C minus, because apparently I did a whole lot of things wrong.
Maybe I'll just ask 1 or 2 questions to start things off before we open it up to the audience. And I'm wondering if I could ask each of you to talk a little bit about where these novels started, and specifically the place that the idea of family had in your mind when you were starting these books.
The running joke about this book is I believe it's all Zadie Smith's fault, because she asked me if I would write a little short story about was strong in character, about characters.
Whose fault?
Zadie Smith. You know her? writer.
You said Zadie?
Zadie Smith, yes.
Oh, I thought you
Zadie
said
Smith.
Dave Smith.
No, Zadie Smith.
Okay.
Zadie was doing this thing called was it the Book of Other People, an anthology, I think, for Dave Eggers, and said, will you write a short story for it? And the whole idea is it should have strong characters. So I was like, sure, I'll do that. And like 7 years later, I finished, and it was about 700 pages long, and it missed the deadline. But I think for me, I was interested in brothers and kind of angry brothers, and it was very curious to me that in this situation that's set up a little bit there, that a brother would come home and find his brother in bed with his wife, but he doesn't kill the wife. He doesn't kill the brother, he kills the wife. I just blew the whole punchline on that. But anyway, so that I was thinking a lot about family and Cain and Abel and just, the big things. I'll pass it on now.
Thanks, Anne. That's a great question, Bridget. For me, the deeply rooted in my own family. I grew up in a military family. My father was a Army Ranger. My wife's father served in the Navy. Her stepfather served in Vietnam. And being in the Midwest, these strong male role models, and then becoming a father myself and seeing just this huge shift in what does it mean to be a man and to be a father, and to see for the deep flaws in that generation, that there were also anytime something breaks in my house, these people, one of these men to call. When I didn't even know what a sump pump was until, my father-in-law helped me change a sump pump. And in a much greater sense, this question of sacrifice and trying to negotiate this legacy of men, a lot of them white, served in the military, worked with their hands, and seeing 20 years later, what's valuable? What do I want from that experience to pass on to my own son or my own kids? And it's a really fraught, it's a really complicated issue for all the amazing things they built and the middle class that they helped really support. Then there are all these questions about race and gender and class that they've failed to resolve. And so, it was questions that were coming up directly as these men started to pass away, my father-in-law and then my wife's stepfather, trying to come to an understanding of the complexity of their effect on my own life personally and then America, large.
Sometimes I have more than one question that I try to answer, or have my characters answer, or at least live out dramatically on the page. And in this case, I think over the years I've noticed how many grandparents, and particularly grandmothers, raise their grandchildren. And I thought about why. And, there are about 6 to 7 million of them in the United States. And I won't even say it, never mind. It's a lot of grandparents, okay? And I wanted to know what would happen if you were almost at a point in your life where you were ready to retire, but your adult children are fuck-ups. And they come back into your life as if they are still children. And what is it you do and you have to do to compensate for their shortcomings, even though you realize that you probably could have done things differently in raising them, but at the time, you didn't realize that you didn't even have the tools, and nor did their father. You gave birth to them, and nurturing and all that stuff, you just sort of feel like because you were there, that was it, even though she loved them. But I wanted to know what it was like to get a second chance and to raise your grandchildren. And not because you want to, but because you feel that they deserve a better chance. And this time, based on the knowledge that you know you didn't have or didn't exercise, that you can try to pass it on or exercise it with them. And I wanted to know if you would resent having to do this, Because a lot of people live for retirement. Right. And now here come these little suckers. It's 2 of them. And, you know, when you get older, you forget about kids. Little ones, they tick to a different beat, and they take up a lot of energy. So I just wanted to know, what would she do differently this time, knowing what she realizes now that she didn't do the last time. So, and then the Who Asked You is people telling her what they think she should do.
Do we have any questions from the audience yet? Or shall I carry on? Mm-hmm.
So all 3 of you are dealing with some, fairly serious issues, but all 3 of you also, I detected just in the short readings, elements of humor that, and to what extent did you consciously employ these instances of humor as you were relating the story?
That's a great question. I mean, I think no matter how beautiful or like complex, if it's just the same note over and over again, it's hard to build any kind of drama or change. And there are writers I went back to, like Faulkner and Toni Morrison, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and they have this like stature. But if you like go back and really study their work and you really look at the language, there is such a diversity in the tone from one scene to the other, and that's what, like when something really terrible happens, that's why it resonates like that, because it's just not this horrible same kind of tone, but it moves dynamically. And so that's something that you try to do, I think, as a writer, is try to build in these moments of humor or like these moments of connection, so that when things fall apart or when things are really difficult for the character, it resonates even more. I think that's, for me, there's this really complicated relationship between this grandfather and grandson. The grandfather he loves this grandson, but he has all these issues about race. And so, for me, it was like a way to help, hopefully, readers sympathize or empathize with him, even though what he's saying or thinking is wrong-headed, that it's coming from this place that he's struggling with. And so hopefully that humor makes him feel more human or accessible.
That's it. To me, I don't deliberately try to be funny. My characters tell the stories in their own voices. I see this as tragic comedy, to be honest with you. I think that a lot of times it's almost to some extent giving a character permission to be absurd in a way, in that we contradict ourselves. We say things that when we know no one's listening, we say a lot of stupid shit. And a lot of stuff is funny, and a lot of it is tragic. What this woman is saying about her kids is tragic to me, even though it's funny to hear it. Right. To think that, you failed as a mother, that's a big deal. And then to blame the kids, for their shortcomings, it's funny what they do and heartbreaking at the same time. But I don't do it deliberately. I don't think, well, gee, let me make this a little funnier. It's how it comes out. And plus, I believe in the power of your character's voice. I love how they think. It's not Terry McMillan's voice, it's my character's. And in this book, I tell a story from 15 different characters' points of view. So, and everybody, I've never been a social worker, I've never been a crackhead, I've never been, well, yeah, I was 8 once. But, it's like you let sometimes your story tells itself. Right. And we're just a conduit. And however it comes out is, as Hunter Thompson say, we play it as it lays, right? No, that's not true. Okay. You're the last person we think of. They told you wrong. Bad teacher.
Right. So here it is now. You're saying you write basically so what is, when you write, or any of the authors on the panel write, are you
I think
Maybe,
for me, sure. I think one of the things, and I remember Grace Paley, who's a wonderful writer, who was a teacher of mine, talked about writing the truth according to the character. So the first thing I think about is not what I want to say or what's accurate for me, but who is this person I'm writing about? What is their background? What is their history? What brought them to this moment that we're meeting them in this story? And that's also how I check to see if I got it right. Did I get it right for that character? Because I'm irrelevant to the story, really. So that's my, you know.
You know what, too? The thing is that you have to understand, we're not trying to educate. You know, most of the time, I would like to think that we write to understand. We don't write about what we already know, because if we did, we'd be journalists.
Right. No, this thing that Terry said about starting with a question, you know, to me, like, it's not a question. If it's a question you can easily answer, like, should we be nice to people, then it's not really worth taking a couple years or 300 pages. These are, you know, the questions you're asking are ones you're struggling with in your own life. And this idea of audience, it's a really interesting concept. Like, ultimately, by the time the book is finished and you've gone through multiple drafts, you are thinking about an audience, like, is this clear? Is this make sense? Is it consistent? What's the experience going to be like for it? But when you start off, for me, you know, everything that starts off with this, something that's going on in my life, or I meet this person, or, you know, the case of my wife's stepfather, this man who served in Vietnam, worked with his hands, and I developed this amazing friendship with, right? And, you know, we'd be fixing something, and he would talk about his experience in Vietnam, and then not talk for 2 hours. And, you know, I was like, well, where's that guy in literature? Like, where does this guy exist? You know, is he struggling with these questions? And so for me, a lot of times, it's the opposite of, like, thinking what the audience. It's like, well, here are these people that are in my life or that I see that aren't being represented in film, or they're not represented in television, they're not represented in other books. And so it's this really selfish, you know, compulsion that you feel so strongly about a particular character that you want to get them down on the page. And I think later is when, after you kind of start to shape it, you ask, like, well, how does this work? You know, how's it going to work for an audience?
Well, the other thing, too, is that you have to take your characters very seriously. You have to think of them as real people, not just characters. And so you make them three-dimensional. You give them flaws and weaknesses, and you make them worry about what's going on in their life at this particular moment, whatever you give them to confront. And like here, I wanted to know, I mean, like, I was dying to know what the little boy was going to say to these questions he was being asked. You know, what kind of girls are you on? I was hoping he'd say, I like boys, to be honest with you, to blow his grandfather's mind. But because he could, you know, he's breaking it down. But it was, and even that tension, I just put myself in the little boy's shoes. Like, I wanted to say, you know, Grandpa, stop asking me so many questions. You know, and what difference does it make? I'm like 7. Was he 7?
He's 16.
Oh,
he's different. Yeah.
But he was a young 16.
Right. He is. Yeah.
Exactly. He talked about
but
that.
But that's all right. But that question, though, you know, that Terry's asking is that idea that you feel
even
so
that makes
strong.
It worse.
Well, yeah. Or, you know, that question that. But again, like, to me, you could write a character that appeases everybody or doesn't make you feel uncomfortable. And that, you know, the thing that Terry mentioned about these characters being the ones who direct the work or direct the story. You know, I've read so many harmless novels and well-meaning, likable stories. And for me, like, fiction is a way to explore these characters you'd otherwise maybe not want to spend a couple hours with. It gives you that opportunity to empathize.
You know, Joe, you just said something so interesting, was going back to what people tell you about writing. So when you go to take a writing class or whatever, often people say, well, I didn't like the character. And I think, well, who cares? Because when you look at the books that we love throughout literature, you don't go, God, Dostoevsky, I love those guys. They're so great. Or like Kafka, that is the best cockroach. That is like the sweetest cockroach. No. Wow.
Humbert. You know,
right,
it's like,
exactly.
You don't want him to babysit.
He is a charmer.
Yeah.
No, but I think it's really important that when you're writing about something, you're writing to understand a person, an idea, an issue, and explore human behavior. It's all about human behavior. And if you're a novelist, I think for many of us, you are writing about what you don't know. Because the truth is, if you're writing what you know, you don't have for most people, not that long of a career, because you run out pretty fast. I don't know.
But no, we don't
You
know.
know,
We don't know as much as people think we do.
Right. So I think
I
that
know I
that's
don't.
important, that you don't have to know about it and you don't have to like the person.
Right.
People always still say that to me, and they'll read like a draft or thing, and they go, am I supposed to like this guy? And I think, I was like, what do I care?
Yeah.
You know, it's more like, how did it affect you? Did it change? Did you learn something? Did you understand something about him?
And I think of Charlie Breedlove from The Bluest Eye. You know, the first time I read that book, the Toni Morrison book, it's this man, and he ends up abusing his daughter. He's, you know, this question of likability, it makes me, and maybe it's like Facebook and having a button where you're constantly liking it.
Yes.
I'm absolutely no interest in the Joe Christmas from Light in August is this amazing character who you don't like this character, but you want to find out. And to me, that's why we have literature. You know, television. I don't want to look at a bunch of people who are uglier than I am on television. Television's great for likable people.
You don't
and
like
film
Empire?
is great.
That's why we have Everybody Loves Raymond.
Exactly.
No.
But for me, like, literature is this place to have these conversations, you know,
Yes.
to think about, like, well, whose voices aren't being allowed as part of the conversation? What characters aren't being represented in these other stories? Yeah, and I have a lot of concern about this idea of likability. You read any Shakespeare, you know, there are very few likable, like Hamlet, not that likable, you know, like very few characters who are likable, but they're compelling, you know, and I think that's what the job of any kind of writer is.
I don't think that they have to be so much likable. For the most part, it helps. But I think that for me, I write about people in situations that I've never been in, for the most part, even people who might think I have. We lie, and I write about characters that I am more curious about. Like, if I were in their shoes, would I do this? Chances are no, but that person is not me. And so it means that I have to develop a certain level of distance, empathy, and closeness to somebody. But I like fill out, I have this dummy job application form, sort of, that I made up to create my characters. And I know everything, what they hate, what they love, what color fingernail polish they wear, what size shoe, their astrological sign, their moon, their rising, how many times they've been laid, do they pay their bills on time, do they write bad checks, they ever been arrested, all kinds of shit. Who they hate, their biggest secret, do they lie, and why, and who to, all of it, and half of it never even makes it into the book. But by this time, and I want to know what is fucking with you right now? What is it? What are you doing that's making your life a mess? That's where I start. And I do it because probably at some point in my time, in my life, it might not be when I'm writing this book, but I've been there too. But it's how are they gonna do it? How are they gonna get out of this mess? Or how are they gonna try to clear it up? They may not clear it up, but they're gonna work at it.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So in the back?
We just got started.
I know. Can you shout? So,
Can you hear that?
yeah, I can repeat it. So the question was, as you're imagining and creating these characters, what sort of research do you go out and talk to people who may have had similar experiences to your characters?
I would say, you know, I wrote a book called The End of Alice. This was about a jailed pedophile murderer, an experience I've not had at any level. I did do an enormous amount of research, so and I actually did not go and talk to jailed pedophile murderers, although I've gotten a lot of letters from them who they feel we have something in common. But I did a lot of research, and I would do it in the same way that Terry's saying. I would look up everything from like the history of prisons, the history of architecture of prisons, you know, the socio-economic development of the person who ended up doing the, you know, all kinds of details and things that don't necessarily make it into the book, but in some ways also give me the confidence to think I know enough about this person, this character, that I can begin to inhabit them. And then I would also say the other side of it is, like for this book with the two angry brothers, I did a lot, and I would look up things like, anger disorders, and there was one called like intermittent explosive disorder, which sounded like a bowel problem, really. But it was a person who, had explosive kinds of rage. So I think, for me, I tend to, in a funny way, approach writing fiction in a very nonfiction kind of way, in a very sort of information-gathering, fact-based thing, so that I understand the worlds of these people and their experiences to then really make them three-dimensional and believable as characters.
Yeah, I think, the way Anne mentioned, for me, everything starts with character, and Terry mentioned this too, in that I could spend, years doing research as a way to avoid, like, actually doing the book, and so having characters and then finding out who they are, and then as Terry said, you want to know this information. So this grandfather is a war veteran who served in Korea, and then there are all the, Korea was the first war in which the American military was desegregated, and this has an effect on the grandfather and his relationship ultimately with his grandson, and looking for connections between what the characters are facing and what their obstacles are, and seeing in the world of the story, the larger world. This book's set in 1995, which was when a lot of the trade policies, American trade policies, began to affect the Midwest. It totally changed the idea of living in the Midwest after NAFTA. And around that time, 1995, is when methamphetamine production and distribution made its way and totally changed the Midwest in a very different way again. And so, when I started the book, I had no idea about, the impact on these other aspects of the story. It was these characters, their relationship, and you kind of start looking at how are the questions these characters are facing, how are they happening in the larger world in some way.
Can we try to sneak in one last question?
I was just curious about something. How they say the actors who play a character, they really get into it. Sometimes they have a hard time getting out of that character. And you are all talking about how lobby-oriented characters have hard times separating from it. Do you live those characters for days at a time? Just curious.
No. When it's over, it's over. I mean, you have to understand, I just finished a book. It was, the first draft was 691 pages. I cut 100 pages almost. That's still long. And let me tell you, everything my character feels, I feel. Okay? I go through, she takes a vacation, she can't get on the plane, whatever. My daughter's pregnant. I'm like, what? So, at the end of the day, if you have somebody has a baby, whatever, you've been through labor too. But when the story is over, when you go through these hills and valleys and they reach a certain plateau where they have overcome something, hopefully, you, for lack of a better cliche, exhale. And you're like, you're happy for them, that they have come from somewhere to here. You don't know where it is, do we?
No.
We don't know, but we know it was better than where they started.
Right.
That's all I know. Otherwise, it's a waste. Again, I used the term earlier as literary masturbation, otherwise, because I want to know. To me, writing fiction is an opportunity. It's a human thing. We're telling stories about people's lives, how they feel, how they tick, and what hurts them, what destroys them, what makes them feel happy, why that shit's missing. And that's the story that I want to tell, and it makes me stronger, hopefully, by seeing somebody that I've created go through it. So whatever it is they want, I'm going to make sure up front they're not getting it. We're going to start there, okay? But when it's over, taco time.
And with that, I think taco time. Thank you to our three wonderful panelists. And I just want to remind everyone again that books are for sale from Greenlight Bookstore after the event. Please support these authors so that they can go on and continue writing the next book. And thank you all again for joining us.
You gotta run, right?
I know, I gotta go.
This guy's